good evening, everyone, and a warm welcome to BIC Streams. Today's session is Full Spectrum, India's Wars, 1972 to 2020. For today's conversation, we have with us Air Vice Marshal Arjun Subramaniam, retired, who is also a military historian. Military advisor to the National Security Council Secretariat, Lieutenant General Prakash Menon, and co-founder of Takshashila Institution, Nitin Pai. We also have some very special guests who you will be introduced to as we go on. The full bios of the speakers will appear in the chat box on the bottom of your screen. If you have any questions, please post them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen next to the chat box. Do follow us on our social media handles on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and do sign up for our mailing list on our website. With this, I hand it over to Air Vice Marshal Arjun Subramaniam.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm absolutely delighted to be here in Bangalore, albeit virtually, to share some perspectives on my latest book, Full Spectrum, India's Wars, a Military History from 1972 to 2020. I'm also extremely grateful to the Bangalore International Center for hosting this event, and to two very eminent public intellectuals from Bangalore, Nitin Pai and Lieutenant General Prakash Menon, both from the Takshashila Institution, who would take forward a discussion on the book after a brief introduction by me. I'm also delighted that Air Chief Marshal Fali Major, a former Chief of the Air Staff, has kindly consented to release the book and say a few words. And before he does so, I would also like to say that I'm particularly happy to have so many family members, friends, coursemate, colleagues, illustrious veterans, and more importantly, some special guests on the show who feature in my book, and I would be taking you through some of their occurrences as we go along. Without much further ado, I'd like to now request Air Chief Marshal Major to please release the book and say a few words.
Thank you very much, Arjun. I'm absolutely delighted to release this wonderful sequel to your previous book, which you've written on for the Full Spectrum, India's Wars from 72 to 20. Before I release this book, I seek your permission to read out a couple of lines from this book, which to me are so befitting during the time of the release of this book, and which you have captured so wonderfully well. Now, let me start by a few lines from your book. It says here in one of your chapters that while it has never been confirmed whether the initial intrusions into Wangduk, I'm referring to Somdurangchu, were with Beijing's concurrence, or whether they were the handiwork of an aggressive local commander. The Chinese did not expect the resultant escalations by the Indian side. Now let me come closer to the date and go further with what you have said again in the same chapter slightly later. It can be argued that the Indian Army's actions at Somdurangchu led to respect for the Indian military from its principal adversary. On the flip side, it shook the Chinese and precipitated a concerted military capacity building in Tibet that would leave the Indians far behind and constantly playing catch up over the next 3 decades. How true and how timely you have said this, Arjun. And with these few lines, and there are many, many more extracts which I could read out from the book, but for the paucity of time, I wouldn't waste anybody's time, but release this wonderful book, which will become, in my opinion, a treasure trove of military history for all those people who are keen to know about conflicts, wars, and their outcomes, and the very charismatic role people in the book and in the conflicts which you reflected have played in the Indian Armed Forces and in the country. And with this, I have great pleasure in releasing your book, Full Spectrum. And congratulations, Arjun, for having done a marvelous job. After that, I remember that very first book, which I had released of yours when I was the chief, and you were the ACAS there in headquarters at that time. Many more occasions for you to shine out like you have now, and keep writing well, and keep the Indian strategic thought alive at all times. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Air Chief Marshal Major, for those very kind and gracious comments. Needless to say, that this book actually would not have been possible without hundreds of veterans and serving officers who shared perspectives on war and conflict in their times. And this is particularly important because from 1972 onwards, chronicles of war and conflict in India have not been declassified. And therefore, there was nothing to go by when I researched all war and conflict other than rely on credible accounts of war, conflict from veterans across the spectrum. And how I did it was that in order to reduce the amount of subjectivity in my narrative, I used a technique which is called triangulation. Wherever there was any doubt in the outcomes or in the analysis that I had reached, I always ensured that I spoke to 2 or 3 other people who were involved in the same battle space to arrive at what I felt was the most probable cause and consequence of a particular operation. Now, that was taking forward from what you said, sir. But let me go back to a bit of a personal issue. Is that I'm very glad and I'm delighted to have my immediate family with me online here. My wife Motika, my daughters Shruti and Meghna, my mother, my brother and his family in Bangalore, my sister-in-law and her family in Bangalore, many other family members from across, and it's really nice speaking to you all, albeit through a virtual medium. I also have a lot of NDA course-mates, a lot of Rimkolians, a lot of old friends from Bangalore, and veterans, as I mentioned earlier. To say that I'm not intimidated by this huge, I wouldn't say huge, but a modest gathering of people who you know so well for years means that I have to tell a story and I have to tell it well. Okay, so I am not really going to talk about the book very much, beyond flagging the fact that it deals with wars and conflicts that India's armed forces have engaged in since 1972. Full Spectrum actually takes you from the jungles of the Northeast to the icy heights of the Siachen Glacier, and across the seas at around the same time to Sri Lanka with the Indian peacekeeping force, and also maneuvering in the desert with General Sundarji, and also foiling a coup across the Arabian Sea in the Maldives. It also takes you through the bloody corridors of the Golden Temple and the almost continuous counter-infiltration and counter-terrorist operations that have been going on since the late 1980s in Jammu and Kashmir. Now, what I also do is that there has been so much written about the Kargil conflict since then. And the biggest challenge for me was, how do I offer a different perspective of Kargil? How do I introspect a little more as far as Kargil is concerned? How do I do a joint perspective of Kargil? Now, one of the things that was missing in our Kargil discourse was this almost concurrent narrative of how the Army and the Air Force operated together, albeit with a little bit of hiccups in the beginning, and then synergized their operations to very effectively evict the Northern Light Infantry from all the posts that they had occupied. So Kargil was a challenging chapter for me to write. And so have been the continuous face-offs, skirmishes, and encounters across the line of control and the line of actual control. Now, for the Indian military knows that it is engaged 24/7, 365 days a year. But does the rest of the country know the extent to which the military is engaged? And that is only if you realize what's going on across the line of actual control and the line of control. It is face-offs, skirmishes, and encounters almost on a daily basis. It's war, but it's war of a different kind. There are no clear concepts of victory and defeat along the line of actual control and the line of control. It is fuzzy. And what goes on there conforms to the changing character of war that I write about extensively in chapter 2 of my book. Full Spectrum is also an attempt to bring military history to a wider readership. And it is devoid of too much of military jargon. And most importantly, it seeks to showcase the contribution of the Indian military, not only in protecting sovereignty and the survival of Indian democracy, but also in India's progressive and steady growth as a flourishing democracy. The Indian military has played a critical part of this journey. And if the next journey is one of becoming a leading power of consequence, I'm quite certain that the Indian military will play a very, very important role, if not a pivotal role, in that progression of India as a nation state. Now, the book is actually divided into 22 chapters. And I'm not going to go over the chapters as such. Suffice to say that it offers a fairly accurate chronological progression of war and conflict. It is accompanied by curated maps. And when I say curated maps, I have sort of made the maps from the script. So there's nothing unnecessary in the maps. They're not cluttered, and hopefully they will give you a bird's eye view of the battle spaces that I'm talking about. The book also has about 100 photographs. Now, this is a large number for a book of this size. And interestingly, a number of these photographs have not been seen before, and they are from personal collections. And I'm extremely grateful to all the veterans, the regiments, the squadrons. Wherever I reached out, I've gathered this huge repository of photographs, from which I managed to select these 100 photographs. As I mentioned earlier, and reiterate with all humility, that this book would not have been possible without my interviews with almost 100 veterans and an equal number of serving officers, many of who I've acknowledged, and several of them who sort of wish to remain anonymous. Had I not drawn on their pool of wisdom and their resources and their experiences, I would not have been able to write this book in the absence of any robust archival material that is available in India. Typically in the West, after 25 years, most records of operations are declassified, and which is why you read so much of military history coming out from the West. Unfortunately, in India, this declassification is still a work in progress, and I'm sure that is high on the list of priorities of the establishment to ensure that material is regularly declassified so that military history as a discipline can flourish. So what I've done today is that I'd like you to take you through my book through the lens of 3 practitioners who feature in my book. One of them you've already heard and seen, Air Chief Marshal Major. The second one is Air Marshal Nana Menon. And the third is Colonel Gurdeep Bains. Now, let me start with Air Chief Marshal Major. Now, Air Chief Marshal Major enters my book in the autumn of 1986 as the commanding officer of 127 helicopter unit, the first Me-17 unit in the Indian Air Force, right? Now, the Me-17 replaced the Me-8, which was a workhorse for a very, very long time. And it came actually in the nick of time. And why do I say it came in the nick of time? There were 2 conflicts that were raging of different kinds across thousands of kilometers. You had the Siachen conflict, which was a full-blown conflict. And then you had this emerging crisis that Air Chief Marshal Major talked about northwest of Tawang, in a place called Wangdong, in the Sundarung-Chu Valley. Now, Sundarung-Chu itself is a valley in the dialect over there. So, Air Chief Marshal Major raised the first Mi-17 unit, and he was thrust into operations straight away. He operated one detachment in Thois, which is the gateway to the Siachen Glacier, and the other one was at Tawang, which is the gateway to the critical sector in the northeast. Now, I'd like to take a paragraph from my book to read out what I've written about Air Chief Marshal Major. And here I go. Air Chief Marshal Fali Major fondly remembers those hectic times when he commanded and operationalized the first Mi-17 unit of the Indian Air Force. And he recounts, while our main task was in support of Operation Meghdut in the Siachen Glacier area, the unit was also inducted into the Tawang sector in support of Operation Falcon. He recollects and adds, this dual tasking to the unit was because of the envisaged high altitude operations in Tawang and the Mi-8's payload restrictions at these altitudes. We had 10 brand new Mi-17s, but only a few qualified pilots. And it was an onerous task to maintain 2 continuous detachments of Mi-17s at Thois and Tawang. Each pilot in the unit used to average almost 100 hours a month during the initial days, switching detachments between Thois and Tawang with a couple of days of rest and recuperation at Hindon. Fali adds, the good part of this deployment was that my pilots were battle inoculated in almost warlike operations of a new type almost immediately after the induction. I was indeed very fortunate to have a fine team. Now, Air Chief Marshal Major stays for a while in my narrative because he had an advisory role to play during the Kargil conflict also, when he advised the Chief of Air Staff and the Commander-in-Chief of Western Air Command while the Kargil air conflict was raging about the efficacy of helicopter operations. And I just quickly go to another part of his. By then, Air Chief Marshal Major was among the most experienced helicopter pilots in the IAF and an air commodore at the time, and attached to Srinagar during the conflict to assess the offensive helicopter operations, which had seen a bit of a hiccup. Because the Indian Air Force had lost a helicopter early on in the conflict, and he was attached to Srinagar to assess the offensive helicopter operations. After flying a couple of sorties and observing the flight path of approaching helicopters in a benign area, he realized that the noise level of approaching helicopters in valleys and mountain tops would render them vulnerable to easy sighting. They could then subsequently be taken down by surface-to-air missiles and air defense guns. He had therefore recommended strikes, that is helicopter strikes, only at dusk, dawn or night, accompanied by a heavy artillery barrage in the same area to mask the sound of helicopters. Now, this is what interests readers, to get into the fine print of how men in uniform think and act during operations. I now move on to Air Marshal Narayan Menon, also called Nana in the Air Force. And for those of you who are unaware of why names are shortened in the Air Force, let me tell you, very simply, it is to be able to communicate in short bursts in the air. So Narayan becomes Nana, Subramaniam becomes Subu or Subi, Banerjee becomes Banjo, Mutanna becomes Muttu, and so on. And if you look at each one of these shortened, it is 2 syllables. So 2 syllables are extremely clear and effective to transmit on the radio. So I just thought I'd slip in this tidbit in between. Now, Nana Menon features in my book as another very, very critical character during the Kargil operation. Pardon my saying so, but he really was a character. And why do I say so? He was the interface between the Indian Air Force and the Indian Army during operations. And he held a post which is called the Air Officer Commanding of Jammu and Kashmir. And he was stationed in Udhampur alongside the Indian Army's Northern Command. And And this is what, and you know, it's a very tricky role, because those of you who are, in fact, most of you know that the world over, armies and air forces always have an axe to grind with one another. They know that they have to work together. They know that they have to deliver together, but it's always, what do I do? What do you do? And then it is, let's do this together. So Nana Menon, Air Marshal Nana Menon had this very, very intricate task of reducing the amount of I and increasing the amount of us. Now, and this is what I write about Nana Menon. Okay. So what I do in my Kargil chapter is that I like to introduce the protagonists. So I introduce the Pakistani generals, all of them, Musharraf, Mahmood Ahmad, Javed Hassan, and I introduce the Indian commanders on our side, General Malik, General Mohinder Puri, Air Chief Marshal Tipnis, Air Marshal Patni, and I also introduce Air Marshal Menon. And I write about him. The task of managing the aerial element of joint operations between Western Air Command and the Army's Northern Command during the chaotic initial days fell on the soft-spoken and amiable Air Officer commanding AOC JNK area, Air Vice Marshal Nana Menon. Nana did a tremendous job orchestrating air efforts of all kinds and smoothing ruffled feathers, which there were many, as he flitted between Srinagar and Avantipur, where several IAF squadrons were operating from, and Udhampur, the headquarters of Northern Army Command. He was the ideal foil to Patni in the field. And then there is another thing about Air Marshal Menon that not many people know, is that he was also Patni's troubleshooter, which means to say that if there was a problem in some of the squadrons, if there was some tweaking to do, if there were some socks to be pulled up, it was Nana Menon who went to the squadrons to assess how things were going on. And he was very candid about how there were issues. I mean to say, we are all human beings when we are leading forces in battle. And unless leadership steps in and tweaks issues and leadership paradigms, that's what Nana Menon did. And I want to read a bit about what happened. I say, the IAF also had leadership dilemmas at the tactical level. Dhanwa and Nambiar both recall the gloom and despondency that had descended on Srinagar and Avantipur when the Canberra was shot on 21st May. And then again a week later when the IAF lost 3 quick aircraft in succession. Nana Menon found that the morale in the squadrons depended on the dynamism of the squadron commanders and their willingness to go into battle, and recollect some tough decisions that were taken to raise mission effectiveness. Once again, human element in the heat of battle is something that all commanders have to tackle with. And you don't read about it much, but that's but that is another thing that I try and bring out in my book at every level, to say leaders in battle are also human. And therefore, the quality of their decision making depends on the quality of training, depends on the quality of camaraderie, and depends on the quality of teamwork that takes place. Now, when I'm talking about teamwork, I now move on to our next guest this evening, and that is Colonel Gurdeep Bains. Now, Colonel Gurdeep Bains and I are classmates from the Rashtriya Indian Military College, Dehradun, India's oldest and a niche military school from colonial times. We were also classmates from the National Defence Academy and the Defence Services Staff College. His story in the book goes back to the early part of the 2000s, soon after the Kargil conflict, when the proxy war and terrorism in J&K had escalated to probably were extremely high levels. And at this time, Gurdeep was in command of the 2nd Battalion of the Parachute Regiment, also called 2-Para SF, because it was also a Special Forces unit and had just converted onto the Special Forces role. Now, several paratroopers and Special Forces units find mention in my book. because you really cannot keep the maroon berets away from the action. So here I go with some vignettes from the book about Gurdeep. And I title that particular portion in which I write about Gurdeep Bains as a commanding officer's tale. And I must share with you that I've been after Gurdeep for years to sort of talk about his stint as a commanding officer. But he refused to talk about it. He says, no, Arjun, it's something that's being done. And all I can tell you is that I think I did a decent job. The unit did well. But I think it was only when he found that I was serious about writing about it in a professional way that he opened up a couple of years ago. And I found his story fascinating. It actually, again, it's not a Superman story. His story reflects the story of many, many commanding officers in infantry regiments, in battalions, in squadrons, and in command of ships. But I just felt that it reflected also several other things. And this is what I write. The 2nd Battalion of the Parachute Regiment Special Forces, or 2 Para SF, was being blooded in combat in Jammu and Kashmir during one of the most violent phases of the proxy war post-Kargil, having been moved to the valley to replace 9 Para Special Forces. Within months of assuming command, Colonel Gurdeep Bains, the commanding officer of 2 Para, was surprised to hear that his battalion was being pulled out of J&K. He wrote to the Army Commander General Nanavati, explaining that the unit needed more combat experience to consolidate in its new role. The Army Commander agreed, and 2 Para continued to operate independently in seek and destroy and deep ambush missions, or as part of a larger multitasking force. The unit added significant value during the high-intensity counter-terrorist operations in the valley. However, Bains felt that the performance of the battalion had been below the high expectations reposed in it. And in 2001, though the battalion had eliminated 21 terrorists and recovered sizable quantities of arms, ammunition, and equipment, their casualties were inordinately heavy, as they lost 4 soldiers and had 9 injured. In a letter to his officers, he wrote, "I bear responsibility for these setbacks and have instituted remedial measures." Bains wrote in a letter to his battalion's officers after intensifying the unit's training regimen. He concluded the letter by adding, "I hope that the rigorous training carried out will manifest itself in good results," which it did. 2 Para was assigned to 15 Corps and deployed with 19 Infantry Division and 28 Infantry Division and with Kilo Force. And then afterwards it moved south of the Pir Panjal and operated with Victor Force and as well as with 6 mountain divisions and 1 corps during Operation Parakram. Bains recollects that during the peak of operations in the summer and autumn of 2002, as many as 6 to 7 teams would be participating in operations at multiple locations. This diffused and dispersed concept of operations demanded exceptional decision-making skills and a team dynamic that developed as the unit gained battle experience. And I end by highlighting what Victor Force wrote about the performance of the battalion, that it had been exemplary. In 3 years under Bains' command, 2 Para had neutralized 83 terrorists, but lost 7 comrades and had 17 wounded. He said that these casualties still haunted him, and at times he still wakes up at night wondering what he could have done to reduce them. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is the dilemma and the reason why many, many commanding officers of elite units, high-performing units, units that suffered during combat, do not really want to talk about their days and years in command, because it brings back not memories of defeat or victory, but memories of those you've lost in combat. Actually, I'm not able to see General Nagaraj. I think he must be attending. But I also wanted to place on record my gratitude to Lieutenant General Nagaraj, another Bangalorean, who spoke to me at length about the planning in Operational Northern Command during Operation Parakram, which I cover in much detail in a chapter that is called Operations Other Than War Along the Western Front. Now, lastly, to the audience, I hope I've been able to offer you a flavor of what the book is all about. Full Spectrum is a book for a full spectrum readership. And whether you are a planner, a policymaker, an academic, a general reader, or a veteran who just wants to absorb more and more of military history and wants to know more about what happened in contemporary times, I think Full Spectrum you will find interesting. On a personal note, my inspiration to write has been my father, who passed away well before I took to writing. He wrote brilliantly, but never stayed the course to write a book. He convinced me that the power of the written word was immense, more than that of the spoken word. Finally, I would like to thank my wife Motika and daughters Shruti and Meghna for their understanding and support during the 8 long years that it took me to write both books, which is India's Wars, A Military History, 1947 to 1971, and Full Spectrum, India's Wars, 72 to 2020. And in lighter vein, it's actually Motika who kept the family ship afloat in choppy seas, you know, when a cranky captain often left the steering wheel to do his research and writing. I think that sums up what the book is all about, how I feel about the book, and I hope I've been able to transmit some of that flavor of what Full Spectrum India's Wars 1972 to 2020 is all about. Thank you very much for a patient listening, ladies and gentlemen. And thank you, Air Chief Marshal Major, Air Marshal Nana Menon, Gurdeep Bains, and General Nagaraj for being here tonight. I would now like to hand over the session to Nitin Pai from Takshashila to take things forward. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Air Vice Marshal Arjun Subramaniam, Air Chief Marshal Fali Major, Colonel Bains, AVM Narayan, Nana Menon, and all of you, General Nagaraj. It's a delight to be here. I think the people at BIC, Ravichandar and the others chose me for this show because I have the maximum combat experience compared to everybody here. So I must know a little more about armed forces than General Menon and as well Subramaniam. But it's indeed a delight and an honor to be here among people who've really fought for the country on the front lines. Some of us pretend and convince ourselves that we are fighting for the country too, but it's not at the kind of intensity and existential level that the participants in this forum have done so and have reflected in this wonderful book. I'd just say a few lines before I'd ask General Menon to step in, because I found the book taking me down my own memory lane. The period covered in the book is slightly longer than my own existence on this planet. But most of the incidents and most of the operations referred to in the book are personal memories for me. They were current affairs when I was growing up. I recall being excited about Operation Cactus as a young NCC cadet in an air wing. And we were really thrilled that the Air Force could do wonderful things, flying all the way to Maldives and participating in an operation of that kind. I remember being very excited about Operation Pumalay. Again, as this was discussed threadbare in my NCC unit in school. And I remember a sense of loss we felt when one of our school seniors and one of my predecessors as a senior NCC cadet in my unit was a captain in the army, was one of the early casualties in the IPKF operations in Sri Lanka. The Punjab conflict and Blue Star and Kashmir, I think we've lived through it. There are memories which we used to see. The lived experience was through newspaper headlines, India Today, Doordarshan. But one of the most interesting paradoxes really for us is that for most Indians, especially those of us living here in the South, we felt largely secure in the whole period. If you read the book, there are 22 chapters. over a period of close to 50 years, that's almost one conflict every 2 years. And as the Air Vice Marshal said, the LAC and LOAC are places where there is day-to-day conflict. It's been going on. Despite this level of violence continuously occurring through the country, a large number of us have really felt safe and secure, enough to go about our daily lives as if nothing really is happening, where a lot of things were happening. So for us, I think we must be grateful to our members of the armed forces who have been at work all through this period. And also, very importantly, the civilians who are in the war zone. That's an entirely different story. The civilians in the war zone along the borders, in places where there was insurgencies, in the states in the Northeast, for example, where they've never enjoyed a normal day. All of these participants are members who've kept us safe. And we must have gratitude to the sacrifices and the lived experiences of all of these people, both the men in uniform, men and women in uniform, as well as the civilians, administrators who kept us safe. And I think that is a profound sense of gratefulness and gratitude that I have for the people in the armed forces. Now, Kargil and later is an entirely different story. I think I know a lot more about Kargil and later for my own good. But the period before Kargil, I think was where I think I learned a lot more from the book, because the book gave me the backstory of what I'd read. The front story was in India Today, was in the World This Week, was in Doordarshan and Indian Express and so on. But the backstory, a lot of it, the personal backstories came together very nicely in this book. And I really like it for that reason. So it's something which contextualizes your experience as a person who's lived through this. Now, here's an interesting part. Almost half the country was born after 1993. So the first half of the book is, unknown to them. And I think it opens up, and it's not taught in history, right? So it's too recent to be in the history books of our curriculum. So I think it opens up a lot of history of knowledge of those times to a population which has never had to see hardship until 2020. And 2020, because of COVID, is when I think all of us are feeling the hardship. But otherwise, the whole generation has grown up without having to understand what it was to be moving there. Now, two little points before I move on and ask General Menon to comment. First is I noticed, it came out very clearly in the book that almost in all of these operations and conflicts, I mean, war is a very strong word to call these things, but conflicts of this nature, more than two services were almost involved. There's Army and the Air Force, or the Army and the Navy. Almost in every case, there were two services involved. The role played by the two services might be lesser or more in certain things, but more of them were involved. But three services were involved in a few of these operations. In Cactus, in the Maldives, in Sri Lanka, of course, and when dealing with Pakistan. So I think one message which seems to come out here is that power projection, for India to project power beyond its shores, to act in a role which is beyond defense, the three services have to come together. It's not going to be done by a single service. So the idea of a joint tri-service nature of this thing comes out. And willy-nilly, and I think you mentioned this very nicely, I won't steal the thunder, you mentioned it so nicely, the coordination between the three services at various times. And that story, I think, is best left to history. I think the future should not have those kind of stories, but new kinds of stories where, the challenges of jointmanship and, joint services come through. Last point, I think moving forward, we will be dealing with the great powers. In the last 20 to 30 years, we dealt with insurgencies, border conflicts, small actors like insurgent groups in India and abroad. But moving forward, we will be contending with the great powers of the world. Now, that's an entirely different game. It means that the verities and the sureties of the last 30 years will not come at play. One point, of course, is jointmanship. But there's a lot of other things. How do you learn to fight together with your allies? we might not be fighting with our own, Air Force, Navy. It's not just jointmanship with our own service, but we'll be fighting with our allies against probably a bigger power and an alliance. So that's an entirely different mental model that we'll need to have. We'll be in cyber, we'll be in space, and of course, a lot of automation involved. So I think the future will be nothing like the past. And your book really gives us a foundation, and I would say a very thick foundation in which to understand where we came from in the last 3 decades, and use that as a foundation to understand the kind of future that we need to build, knowing fully well that the future is going to be extremely, extremely different. The entire context will be different. And the fact that COVID has played such an important, black swan kind of a role in our military preparedness, our public finances, I think that's going to be a very important factor in shaping the future. So those are the little few comments, disjointed as they are, which I had. And I would like to invite Jan Menon to say a few words. You're on mute.
Thank you, Nitin. And firstly, let me congratulate Arjun Subramaniam for this wonderful book. It makes me very proud, because I think what the service that you're rendering is filling a vacuum in our ability to record the past. And I disagree with Nitin's contention that the future will be completely different. I think the present and the future should be informed by the past, because otherwise there is no way that we can deal with the future nor the present. So whatever we might see as changes in form actually has a very strong thread which runs through it, which remains the same, which is the nature of the subject itself, war and conflict. Eventually, for the people at the front end of conflict, whether he was wielding a shield and a sword, or whether he is actually flying an aircraft, the presence of danger, uncertainty, chance, and probability remains the same. Survival is still at stake. So for the soldier in combat, whether it was 1,000 years ago or a soldier of the future, the situation would probably be the same. It will only change in form. And therefore, that is why we need to learn the past. And what Arjun does, and what I like is, this is a sequel to his past book. The first book is about the first 25 years of India's history, military history. That itself is wonderful. It captured all the three big wars of 47, 65, and 71. What he does now is that 50 years after that. And it's coincidental that I was commissioned in 72. I was with the government till 2017. So I really had a ringside view from inside. And I can quite understand why Arjun has to adopt this means of actually trying to find out, excavate history through the experiences of others, rather than trying to look for written material which is called official records. I quite understand the predicament. And this is an Indian weakness. Either we preserve it very poorly, or even if we preserve it, we do not make it applicable for others to learn. How do soldiers learn except from their experiences of the past? You can't fight the wars of the future actually except in our minds. And those minds have to be sharpened by the experiences of the past. So Arjun is doing a real great service, not only to the armed forces, but to policymakers, to any people who are interested in the field, even to youngsters. And this period is about war change, and he calls this Chameleon Wars. And this is another term which he uses quite widely, which is hybrid warfare. And what it captures is that none of these are actually wars in the sense that we know it. They're not even classified as wars because politicians find it difficult to define them as wars. So we use conflict, we use low limited conflicts, we use operations less than war, other than war. And it's very surprising even today that what is happening in Ladakh, we don't have an operation which is named after it. I was trying to find out, do we have an operational name for it? No, probably it is politically inconvenient to give it one. But for people who are out there, it is nothing less than conflict. It's just a matter of defining it in the manner that we are talking about. So what Arjun does in this part, in the sequel, is actually capturing the heart of all these conflicts and trying to view them to people who he knows and who I know also very well. So I know the observer and also the participant who's telling him the story. And in many cases, especially all that happened on the Western Front and in J&K and Siachen, I'm also very much part of that story, including being a company commander on the Billafon. And Arjun very nicely mentions my unit, 7 guards. And when I sent it to my unit, they were all very proud that they were mentioned, but there was a lot of controversy on many issues which were raised in the book. I mean, that's how it is. So memory actually also is not something which you can depend upon all the time. And that is one thing which we have to cater for. But I don't think in present times, we could have had anyone better to actually narrate this. Not because of the fact that he's an Air Force officer, because the spirit of his inquiry. And that's what I realized when he did the NDC when I was the commandant, that he had the spirit to find out. It was a quest. He made it a mission in his life. For everything, he called it a mission. And I can understand that fighter pilot in him was actually trying to fulfill the mission all the time. And he's done this wonderful job of fulfilling a mission. It could definitely be something which not only armed forces officers reach, just to capture what is actually being done, because the point is, none of this is possible from the outside. What he has narrated is because of people from the inside. Although historically, probably classical historians would say that it is better to record history from the outside. But I think as far as these types of wars are concerned, they are better seen from the inside, to be explained as why is it fought the way that it is. And if you really look at the wars that he's described, they're internal wars and they are ones which are external. The internal wars have got a common thread which goes through it, that the armed forces at the end of it feels that they were left down. They did their job, but the politicians were not up to it. And that we can see in the story which is recounted by several readers, even about J&K or whether it is the Northeast. It was about the fact that the military instrument can do this much in internal wars, but finally it is left to the politicians to actually utilize what force is achieved and capitalize on it. And that, I think, is a national failure which we still experience probably even in J&K and in the Northeast. And the wars, the external wars, one of the things which comes out is that in these types of wars, it is the initiative of military leaders which matters the most. The guys who actually take action and don't ask the guy on top is normally better off finally in the game. The moment you wait for orders from Delhi, you're probably getting yourself into a situation where you are the fall guy. Because if anything goes wrong, you'll be blamed and you'll be asked why you didn't do it while you were waiting for orders from top. So I think in many of the incidents, and especially Sumdrongju and Nathula, you'll find that this, and even in case of probably Ladakh today, that's what would be the case. So what we learn from here is that what we lack probably is at the higher level of the higher defense organization. The interface between the politician, the military leader with the bureaucracy is our weakest point. It is not where flesh meets metal. That is the strongest point. That is where the human spirit normally rises up to whatever demands that the organization makes of it. The highest level of human spirit in combat. And that is what we see in each of these. But what is lacking, and Arjun brings it up, is the need all the time to do the same thing. How do we actually strengthen jointmanship? How do we strengthen the interaction between the political and military leadership? And I hope that what has recently been done will actually bear fruit in terms of the CDS and so on. But the point is, it remains an area of weakness. And we cannot, as military leaders, as the book brings out, blame the politician. We are also equally to blame. The fact that we need to operate together is what we know. We have improved quite a lot. There is no doubt. But I am a little wary of how we are moving forward on that. And especially recently when the Prime Minister visited Ladakh, he had the army chief and the CDS with him. I am surprised that he didn't have the air chief. Is it that we don't visualize that air power is not going to be brought to bear if push comes to shove in Ladakh? I don't think so. It would have been a good message if the air chief had gone along. So it's probably just a symbolic thing, but it would have really made a difference. And lastly, I understand that what this book really, since I had quite a lot of knowledge of this actions before, what it tells me about more in a clearer manner was the role of air power itself. It sort of stares me in my face. But I can't help but tell you that sometimes it left me with a Republic Day feeling. Let me just explain what that is. I've attended quite a lot of Republic Day parades. I sit on that chair, I look at the parade, and you have these marching contingents which comes along, really putting in their best, sweating away to glory, very impressive. And when they go away, in the end comes the Air Force. And in those couple of minutes when the Air Force reaches for the skies in glory, they take away all the memory of those people on the ground who have put in so much effort. So in some cases, I get that Republic Day feeling of, because Arjun writes it quite a lot, and he's this thing with the Air Force, I can quite understand. But in some cases, I get that feeling. It's prejudiced, but I think what he has done is actually to invite attention to an arm which India can only neglect at its peril. That must be very clear. And if that lesson is drawn from this, I think we would have done a great service. So once again, Arjun, it's a wonderful work. Heartiest congratulations. You really make me proud.
Thank you. See, I think when I was talking to you people about my role here, I said I'm going to be air traffic control, right? So my job is to be air traffic control for the next 35 minutes or so. But before I invite audience questions, I have just one question which I want to pose to both of you. If you were to look back and reflect on these 50 years or 22 chapters in the book, what do you think is similar through the 22 chapters or most of the 22 chapters? What's the common factor there? The differences we can find a lot. The Maldives is extremely different from Nagaland, is very different from, the line of control. But what would be similar in general, a historian's view and an insider's view also?
Now, this takes me back to the theme of the Golden Jubilee seminar that General Menon orchestrated, and I was a part of that team that sort of looked at it. It was the role of force in statecraft. And I must confess that when it comes to the role of force in statecraft, I feel that the single thread that runs through the book and through these 50 years is that India has primarily been a responsible, restrained, and yet most of the time diffident power when it comes to the exercise of force as an instrument of statecraft. And that whenever India has demonstrated proactiveness, the ability to preempt, and the ability to sort of take the bull by the horns, it has tasted success instantly. And success again is very, very relative. You know, in the past, before 1971, victory and defeat were very easy to sort of measure. After 1972 and the changing character of war, victory and defeat in today's times are almost impossible to measure. We need to more look at outcomes. So what the single thread I feel is that whenever India has seized the initiative militarily or strategically, it has paid rich dividends. And I've always wondered why that has not been done more often. We seem to prefer being surprised. We seem to prefer being pushed onto the back foot initially and then drawing on our reserves and resilience to hit back and hit back with strength. I think that is something that I never identified with throughout my service career. Throughout my service career, I used to always wonder, why is the Indian state not a little more proactive and assertive and comfortable with the exercise and using the instrument of force as a tool of statecraft? Now, I know General Menon, I've had several conversations with him on this. Maybe I will leave it to him to take forward his sort of single thread.
I think we should be very clear that the quality of our political leadership and their ability to use the military instrument as a tool of statecrafts is limited, both by the understanding of what that military instrument can achieve and what it cannot achieve. And I think there will be people who do that, but I think they will be very rare and few of them. They were before and they will be. I think we have to just accept that as a probable state of affairs as we go forward. I don't think we can overcome this because it is rooted in much other issues. And I don't think there's an easy way out, except for the fact of an increased conversation between the military leadership and the political leadership. But it is my experience that even as they profess that they actually want to get closer, they lose interest the moment anything is long-term, unless there is an immediate crisis. That's when they want to actually be closer, understand, but it's too late by then. And that is what the problem is, that the understanding between these two is at the heart of civil-military relations. Both have to understand what the politicians want. The politicians have to actually understand what this military instrument can do. This is the heart of military. And this is where we are actually weak. And I don't see the prospect that it is going to be strong, although I see that it can certainly get better, hopefully, with the restructuring and the appointment of the Chief of Defense Staff. The second point I want to make to answer your question, Nitin, is as military leaders and as political leaders, we must understand that surprise will always be a constant presence. You can do what you want. This is conflict, this is war. One side has the initiative most of the time. And you will be surprised. The important thing is what you do after you are surprised. That is important. That is what military leadership is supposed to deal with. That is what political leadership would deal with. So if in the past we were surprised, I'm afraid we'll have to be prepared to be surprised in the future. You may blame the intelligence agencies, you may blame so and so, but the fact is, history tells us you will be surprised, and that I don't think is going to go away. Yeah.
So thank you. That's really really insightful things to take back in terms of your responses. I mean, really worth the 90 minutes that we spend on it. Price of weight in gold. I'll just go to some of the questions now. I think General Muthana has this very first question on strategic culture, or rather the lack of our strategic culture. And his question is, how do you enthuse various parts of the government beyond the armed forces to appreciate the shortcoming, the lack of a strategic culture? I'll just give you my quick, it's an important point, and I just want to make a contribution to this before you respond, because I have a different view. I think we have a strategic culture, and the strategic culture runs through our political establishment from Jawaharlal Nehru to Narendra Modi, and that maybe even to Emperor Akbar, Aurangzeb, the British Empire, and before that. The strategic preoccupation of India's leaders seems to be to keep this land united under one regime. And most of the energies of our political leaders, whether it's Akbar or Narendra Modi, is occupied in this enterprise. How do you keep this vast land under one rule, under one regime? Now, there's a political dimension to it, which is nicely dissipated through electoral politics. What we used to do with wars 500 years ago, we do with elections now, which is a improvement. But that's only limited. The strategic space, which we call the Indian subcontinent, is much larger than the Republic of India's borders. So the preoccupation continues. And I don't think this is necessarily a bad way of looking at a strategic culture. It's not that you have to be Alexander the Great in order to say that you have a strategic culture. You could have a strategic culture that is uniquely Indian, which is preoccupied with unity and single regime. But the challenge really is, in the 21st century, looking inwards and staying united is not enough. Because to preserve your unity indoors, in a domestic unity, you need to be able to project power abroad. So if you're not able to, if the Republic of India is not able to project power beyond its borders, the ability to keep domestic unity secure will be at risk. In other words, by the same strategic culture which I claim that the civilian leadership has, the requirements, what you need to do to protect your unity has changed dramatically, and now it involves projecting power abroad. Not just at our borders, but probably even beyond. But that's my view, and I wanted to put that across because this is a very common lament which I've seen, ever since I think probably George Tanham, that saying that we don't have a strategic culture. We do have a strategic culture, but it just happens to be very different from what Western scholarship on strategic culture, says that is a requirement. Over to you.
Okay, I can see this question is from Muthu, an old friend, retired as the chief test pilot of HAL very recently, Commodore Muthana. Now, his question, more than strategic culture, he's looking at a niche dimension of strategic culture, and he calls it security strategy culture. So I assume that he's talking about a subset of our DNA, which deals with security issues. And on that count, I think he has a point when he says that our security strategy culture is a little nebulous, doesn't conform to what is expected of a leading power. And I would tend to concur with that for the pure and simple reason that, let's look at it this way, that I look at all instruments or tools of statecraft or pillars of statecraft as not running as parallel tracks, but starting off as parallel tracks, but converging at some distance, at some distance ahead of you. So if you look at it, whether it's diplomacy, whether it is the instrument of force, whether it is technology, the technology domain, whether it's the economy, all these instruments of statecraft have a security dimension embedded in them. And there isn't adequate synergy between all these pillars of statecraft to ensure that the security dimension of our strategic culture is robust enough to take us from where we are to where we aspire to be in the years ahead, which is to be maybe a power of consequence and then a leading power. So let me just give you one of my ideas. From 2010, from the time when General Menon was the commandant of the NDC, we've been saying that every NDC course must include young members of parliament who can come in regularly and attend courses or attend talks at the NDC on a regular basis. It happens in the United Kingdom. Today, the National Defence College had a seminar with the Royal College of Defence Studies, and they have members of parliament attending the RCDS program from time to time. What that does is that creates a certain amount, that creates a security culture within the political establishment, which leads to a greater understanding of national security, and thereby reinforcing your strategic culture to meet the outcomes of the future, which is India to be a leading power in X number of years. So there are several, I think there are several methods to improve national security consciousness. And I think one of the things that one of my endeavors in writing these two books is precisely to do that, to take military history beyond the military community so that there is a far greater consciousness of what the instrument of force cannot do, has succeeded or failed, in history. So that's my take on this question.
There's a nice follow-up which comes quite later from Rishi Atreya. He says, and I think it's related to this, that does the change of political parties make any real difference to, or is there any common thread in military strategy?
There is a common thread that runs through military strategy, as has been seen by the Indian state. Okay, and whether and I don't think the political culture or the political dispensation has made too much of a difference, but it has. In fact, the way I look at it is that political parties, different political parties, or the two major political parties in India, both the Congress and the BJP, have very similar aspirations as far as national security is concerned. But the instruments and the road to that national security have varied from time to time. And I, for one, feel that the variance is mainly in the robustness of the military response. The variance is probably in the extent of restraint. The variance is in the diffidence. And in that context, I will put my sort of, I will put my money on, and to say that when it comes to articulating robustness of security responses, I feel that historically the BJP has had a more, outward-looking and a more robust response to national security crises. How it has panned out on the ground probably is something that has to be analyzed. But that's my take on this. In terms of has there been a political difference in approaches towards national security? The answer to it is yes, there has been.
General Menon, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, actually, George Sternham actually triggered this debate in India, and what he wanted to convey really is that you guys should become like us. Be quick on the draw, take the gun out and shoot anybody who's actually trying to oppose you. I think Indians are much more wiser than that. To say that we don't have a strategic culture is actually believing what the Westerners are trying to tell us, that you should become like us, and we certainly should not. And I think we have the wisdom that this instrument is an instrument which is required to protect our interests, promote it, but we must use it with the utmost care. And when we want to make decisions about using it, we must have not only strength behind it, we must have wisdom behind it. And I think that's something which we believe in. Politicians of different varieties might have different ideas. And this is all about domestic politics, that I am actually much more stronger. I want to capture POK, I want to capture Aksai Chin, is selling actually non-doables to the gullible and wanting to tell the domestic public that we are a much stronger party than the other party. But that's politics. So I think as far as politicians are concerned, we will still be restrained by the inability of political leaders, as I said before, to actually understand what this instrument can do and what it cannot do, because their attention span is linked to crises, not to the long-term nature of developing that instrument and its application.
Yeah, Rishi, my own little contribution to that would be, book and the broader pattern. The correlation seems to be more with the political leader that you have, the prime minister that you have, rather than the party that the prime minister belongs to. Because we went to the Maldives and in Sri Lanka projecting power beyond our shores when Rajiv Gandhi was was prime minister. So it's something which even now people would look and say, what possessed us? Why were we doing things far beyond our capability or beyond our, why did our ambitions extend to such a great extent? Anyway, let me come to a question which Kajari has. Kajri Kamal asks that this is about the Sundarongchu incident. There is a story that offensive use of force was contemplated by the establishment, by the political establishment, but later given up for good reasons. Is it true? And what were the good reasons?
Okay. I think this is. I think there's a bit of a anomaly over here. I don't think the offensive option was considered by the political establishment, but it was certainly considered by Sundarji. In fact, General Narhari, who was the corps commander of 4 Corps, and General J.M. Singh, who was the divisional commander of 5 DIV, were told by Sundarji to plan an offensive across the line of actual, or to prepare for an offensive across the line of actual control, which is why you had the Bofors gun. The Bofors gun, if you remember, was inducted at that particular time. And the first battery, one of the first batteries of the guns was moved up ahead of Tawang. Can you imagine? At that time in 1986. So the intent was there. The capability was there. General J.M. Singh, who was the divisional commander, was my primary resource for the book. And one of the most satisfying chapters that I've written in my book is the chapter called Standing Up to the Dragon, in which I write about Sundarongchu. And the military establishment did plan for a small limited offensive across the line of actual control. They even looked at the Chinese garrison of Leh, which is across LE, not LEH. But then I think wise sense prevailed, and as General Menon says, that's when the political establishment said, okay, that we've done enough. Now it's time to get back onto the drawing board. So the answer to Kajri is that yes, there was an offensive option planned, but I think it was mainly at the operational level and did not get any kind of political clearance for that.
That's nice. I have a question by K.S. Nair, and I think that's one of the earliest, it brings me memories of, I think, a conversation with General Kalkat back in 2000 about, once you get involved so much in counterinsurgency and counterterrorism, how does this affect the armed forces? So his question, K.S. Nair's question is, how has this influenced the military's readiness for conventional set-piece military operations?
This is a conversation that was a conversation that I would say was extremely hot during the initial decade of the current century. But I think over the last decade, armed forces across the world have realized that full spectrum operations is the de facto normal. And there was a time when the Indian Army, when it was felt that the Indian Army had got into an excessive counterinsurgency mindset, and therefore, how would it reset the button if it had to go into operations, conventional operations, across multiple fronts? I think the last decade has seen both the Indian Army and the Indian Air Force prepare itself extremely well for full spectrum operations. And I don't think that it is so much of a dilemma today to switch forces between counterterrorism, counterinsurgency, and conventional operations, as long as you have continuously trained troops who are capable of adapting. And that is why I say it's not only military leaders, but even soldiers right down, to the Havaldar or the Subedar Major have to be ready for flexibility, for change, for adaptability. And I think that has been incorporating in training regiments.
But isn't it that when you're doing counterinsurgency, you're basically shooting at your own citizens, and when you're fighting conventional thing, you're fighting uniformed representatives of the adversary? Does that have a psychological?
Oh, yes. Again, if it has a psychological impact, I think the army leadership has realized it a number of years ago, that if you have a psychological impact, you need to create mechanisms, training mechanisms to ensure that that psychological impact doesn't cause people to take wrong decisions in diverse battlefields. So it is a problem. It's a problem that is here to stay. But we have no choice but to exploit both platforms and the human being across the spectrum of conflict. And that is why, if you see, if you see, I had no dilemma in titling my book, because no other armed forces in the world has had the sheer diversity of operations that India's armed forces have experienced. And you talked about counterinsurgency. Yes, it is difficult, because Indian counterinsurgency is steeped in the concept of, it's your own people whom you're fighting against. And therefore, restraint, responsibility, and fighting with one hand tied behind your back is actually what the Indian Army does in counterinsurgency operations. So,
yeah, actually, let me give you an example. I was commanding the Hajipur Brigade in Parakram, and we had to make a quick switch because I was deployed for counterinsurgency in northern Kashmir, Kupwara, and the switch had to be just immediate, and it is certainly a challenge. But the point was that the plans which we had to finally execute was already something which it was not kept in storage. They were constantly updation of those plans. I mean, they were something which we knew could happen anytime. So it was something which we could be visualized. And therefore, but I would completely agree, for the man who's fighting a counterinsurgency, who's actually fighting a counter-terrorist operation, for that battalion to suddenly switch, it's not so easy. It doesn't come. So there is a price that you have to pay. But the point is, you try to make it up. I mean, it is not the ideal. And that is something which we cannot help. In fact, I must tell you, and Arjun recounts this in his book, in 2002, when the Mirages were first used in the Khair sector in North Kashmir, when actually Pakistanis had encroached. And Arjun describes that incident, and he also describes the incident of the Mirage firing. I was there. My brigade was the one which was supposed, in case the Air Force could not do it, I was supposed to be the one who was supposed to go and do the job. And I remember that the Mirages came, they fired, and in fact, the bombs never hit because the target was very small. That it never hit the target, but it was so close that those guys ran like hell. And more than anything else, when we saw the intercepted communications, the psychological effect of air power, even amongst the higher leadership, was what won us the day. And I think that's something which we need to remember. That's a lesson which I carried from there.
Gautam Murthy has a very interesting question, and I think I would sort of expand on that question. Is about very often building military capacity for strategic purposes requires multi-year financial outlays, but people don't have that kind of attention span. I wouldn't just accuse the politicians of it. I would accuse the media and even the ordinary citizen of having a very short attention span. So would you think that, the sense of their commitment to continue to spend funds once a crisis is over? What's your sense?
Nitin, I think the two of you and General Prakash Menon, are perfectly sort of poised to answer that question. I'm not too much of a finance guy. I'm more of a plain vanilla historian. So I think maybe you and General Menon would like to address the long-term, what could be a long-term strategy to ensure that what General Gautam Murthy says can be translated into reality on the ground.
I think I'll punt it to General Menon.
When the government of India collects its taxes, its fundamental role with those taxes is to ensure the security of the state. That it's the bounden duty, constitutionally they swear by it, to protect the state. And protect the state, obviously, in terms of its territoriality and its sovereignty. So the government cannot say we don't have any money. We are collecting taxes, but we don't have any money for the defense of the state. I think that is not an argument which really can be done. It has to find the money, and it has to take away money from, if necessary, and depending upon what the priorities the government have, it has to actually raise extra money, not for defense. Extra money will have to raise for other activities that it wants to do. But what governments have actually done, and this is the declining state of the defense budget, both in terms of the percentage of GDP and in terms of percentage from central government expenditure, CGE, geopolitical disturbances and turbulence is growing. India's defense budget in terms of its allocation is decreasing. This is something which is unacceptable. And it's not about any political party, it's about the way they look at it. And I think it's time that this is reversed. You cannot say that you don't have the money to defend the country. That cannot be an argument. But unfortunately, this has been the state of affairs. And even today, that's the tragic part. The central government, the finance ministry has cut 20% of the budget across the board, including the Ministry of Defense. When the enemy is at our gates, it's something which is unacceptable and unthinkable. So I think this has to be a change of attitude, because this is something which you can't compromise on simply because you have sworn by the Constitution to defend this country.
Yeah, I think obviously, yeah, go on.
There's one thing when we were discussing earlier, it's just playing, I think I should just, General Menon spoke about Operation Parakram, and during the time when he was commanding a brigade and things like that. I spent a full chapter on that operation. And it's a chapter that's given me a great amount of satisfaction to write, because there were a lot of people involved whom one has served with and whom one has interacted over the years. For example, General Menon was commanding that brigade. General Nanavati was the Northern Army commander. Air Marshal Gandhi was the Western Air commander. A close friend of mine was commanding the Mirage Squadron, which was tasked with carrying out that particular mission. Now, that Mirage Squadron commander, the day before, has done a practice mission on a completely different, on a different set of targets that were given to him, because the targets were not supposed to be divulged till the last day. And what General Menon says is again so very true, and it also manifested itself in Kargil. The psychological impact of air power, particularly in the mountains, is so intense. And it is a major contributor for psychological collapse. And if you look at what Naseem Zahra, who's written an excellent book about From Kargil to the Coup, he mentions that Indian air power actually caused a lot of psychological confusion amongst the Northern Light Infantry and actually hastened their particular collapse. So I was just digressing back to the book, but I just wanted to mention that the book has several such nuggets of operations that are not entirely in the open domain.
I reading your book confirms my view that I think we overstate the fact that we are not strategically capable. We could not have built a track record of 30 years of economic growth, immense prosperity and security for so many people if we were not strategic minded. It so happens that we look at the strategic expenditure or defense expenditure on a day-to-day basis, and everything is transparent and open, which sort of scares us into saying, how is it that this chaotic looking beast can come to do something coherent, as opposed to a very opaque system like, let's say, our northern neighbor, where you look at it and you just see the dot, and the dot seems to be a straight line, and it seems to be all wonderful, and the whole chaos and the sausage making is invisible to you, right? So I think that is true, but which we also, the flip side to our situation is, I think, being suboptimal with the way we do things. We could do things a lot better It's not that we're doing things, we could do a lot better. And coming to defense itself, defense expenditure, General Menon mentioned, I think we have to put the line that defense expenditure must come from the government's budget. It is as Admiral Arun Prakash said, it is the first charge on the exchequer. You have to cater for defense and your core development expenditure first, and then you do various other things like Air India and all the various really discretionary expenses that you have. Defense and core development is not a matter of discretion. It is core. That is the reason why citizens pay taxes. That is the reason why government exists. Discretionary expenditure is where you have discretion. And that's where you're more than welcome to cut short, because the government of India runs a soap company. Why are we running soap companies? Why are we having bicycle companies, etc.? Which, for what great strategic reason? Are we going to run out of soap during war or something like that? So I think that line has to be made clear. And in the coming years, when we see a lot more fiscal dire straits, I think this point has to be made very clear. Focus on the most important priorities and cut down on discretionary expenditure. I think we've answered many of the other questions, maybe not directly, but I want to ask you, now we have only about 4 minutes to go.
Yeah.
I would like you to sort of make a sort of concluding remark, both of you, maybe General Menon first and then the author, about, what is the lesson from this book? If we have to capture that lesson in 90 seconds, what would be the lesson from the book?
That we must learn from the past, and that past tells us one of the weakest points which we have is about doing things together, about cooperation. And that actually there are two levels: cooperation between the military and the civil, and cooperation within the military itself. And I think that's a major lesson which we can take from this book.
My major mission, I would say, as General Menon says it, or my major mission was to bring contemporary Indian military history to a genre of readers and a generation, like you said, which hasn't been exposed to this kind of information or this kind of knowledge.
Good discussion.
And the other thing was that I've always been I've even been angry about the fact that military history has always been a neglected dimension of contemporary Indian military history. And I suspect, and that made me even angrier, was that I suspect that it was deliberately done because it was seen as a forgettable legacy of our colonial past. And therefore, my mission is to draw military history back into the mainstream historical discourse so as to be able to tell the country that India's military is a vital cog in Indian democracy and on India's march to becoming a leading power.
Oh, that's a fantastic last line. I wouldn't spoil it by adding anything to it. And I would I can't do anything more than hand it over back to Lekha and the organizers to bring this wonderful session to an end. I want to thank both of you and the other wonderful people who are on the show today, and the participants, many of who are Takshashila students. I'm sure you've learned a lot from this 90 minutes. So over to you, Lekha.
Thank you for that fascinating conversation and for providing us a starting point to explore the full spectrum, as it were. To have such an important record of contemporary history that we as a population have such poor awareness of, and what's more, to have the people who were there crafting this history with us to tell us these stories and help us put a human face to these legendary tales is such a privilege. As a millennial, I have to thank Air Vice Marshal Subramaniam for taking up this Herculean research project, resulting in 2 books. Thank you, General Menon and Nitin, for being on the panel. Air Marshal Nana Menon, Colonel Bains, for taking the time for joining us, and Air Chief Marshal Major for doing the honors. Good night, everyone, and see you next time.
Thank you. Good night. Good night, folks, and thank you. Thanks for listening in. Air Chief Marshal Major, thank you very much. Nana sir, thank you.
Thank you, Arjun and Nitin and General Menon, for a wonderful evening and an excellent show. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, sir.